What happens when a political gamble on global dominance spirals into unexpected retaliation from the world's second-largest economy? In today's increasingly volatile geopolitical landscape, few names evoke as much division, defiance, and drama as Donald J. Trump. From bold speeches about winning trade wars to sweeping tariffs against Beijing, his presidency redrew the lines of international diplomacy. But now, in a move that has sent shockwaves through global trade routes, China has reportedly blocked vessels linked to Trump-affiliated businesses from docking at its ports. A powerful gesture, not just of economic retaliation, but of political reckoning. This development isn't a headline you can scroll past. It's a direct hit at the very core of American trade influence. And more than that, it's a sign that the aftershocks of Trump's decisions are far from over. Las decisiones de Trump salieron mal. A statement echoed not just in foreign media but also in financial boardrooms, diplomatic circles, and among anxious exporters across the U.S. During his time in office, Trump championed a combative strategy against China, promising to bring jobs back to America and rebalance what he described as a rigged system. He slapped tariffs, restricted tech access, and declared that the U.S. would no longer be taken advantage of. But now, the long-term cost of that aggression is surfacing, and it's America's own industries feeling the burn. Why is China refusing Trump-linked ships entry into its ports? That's the question reverberating across Wall Street, Washington, and the world. Some say it's a form of delayed retaliation. Others argue it's a calculated power play ahead of the 2024 U.S. election, a strategic move to remind America that China can hit back, surgically and symbolically. The timing isn't random. With Trump hinting strongly at a 2024 comeback, China's posture feels eerily precise. These aren't just trade disruptions, they're geopolitical messages carved into shipping routes and export logs. And behind every denied docking clearance lies a narrative of defiance, resentment, and unresolved tension. Look closely and you'll see how this maneuver fits into a broader pattern. Over the past year, Beijing has slowly recalibrated its diplomatic tactics, opting less for loud public spats and more for behind-the-scenes power plays. Restricting Trump-associated vessels isn't just about trade, it's about memory, it's about consequence, and most importantly, it's about influence. The irony is thick. Trump's base once cheered his hardline stance against China, convinced it would secure American supremacy in the global market. But now the consequences of that approach may be unraveling U.S. leverage, one blocked port at a time. Behind the scenes, logistics chains are scrambling, companies are rerouting goods through friendlier nations, and quiet panic is growing among exporters who relied heavily on Chinese access. This is not merely a story of politics gone wrong. It's a cautionary tale of what happens when geopolitical aggression meets strategic patience. For every sanction imposed by the Trump administration, China may have silently prepared a counter, and now it's playing its cards, precisely, powerfully, and publicly. So, how deep does this go? And what does this mean not just for trade, but for America's place in the global power hierarchy? Because this story, it's far from over. And as we dive deeper into this unfolding situation, it's crucial to pause and reflect on what this truly represents. Not just for politics, not just for economics, but for all of us watching the future take shape in real time. This isn't just about Trump. It's about understanding how the decisions of one leader can ripple across oceans, disrupt livelihoods, and challenge the stability of nations. It's about recognizing the weight of diplomacy, the cost of pride, and the importance of discernment in leadership. As the world edges closer to yet another pivotal election cycle, the choices made today are shaping the global reality of tomorrow. So I want to hear from you. Do you think this was a justified move by China or a dangerous escalation? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective matters, and together we can build a space for real conversation. If this video helped open your eyes to something deeper, leave a like so more people can find it. And if you believe these are the kinds of truths we need to keep unpacking, make sure you're subscribed, because we're just getting started. Most importantly, let's take a moment to pray for wisdom in leadership, for peace among nations, and for discernment in these turbulent times. The world is watching, and so are we. Trump's trade war backfires. What once appeared to be a bold and fearless strategy to reclaim economic power has begun to unravel in ways even Trump's fiercest critics didn't fully predict. The idea was simple on the surface: confront China head-on, apply pressure through tariffs, and force a renegotiation of the rules that Trump argued had unfairly benefited Beijing for decades. In campaign speeches and presidential briefings, the message was consistent. America was being taken advantage of, and under Trump's leadership, that era would end. But while the rhetoric made headlines and energized a certain slice of the American electorate, the long-term consequences of this gamble are now surfacing with stark clarity. In the first wave of Trump's trade war, tariffs were imposed across a range of Chinese goods, from steel and aluminum to electronics and consumer products. The intention was to make Chinese imports more expensive, thus encouraging American companies to return production home. But Beijing, far from folding, responded with equal force, slapping tariffs on key American exports, particularly those from agricultural states that had supported Trump politically. The result was a retaliatory spiral that disrupted global supply chains and hurt both economies. Yet what we're seeing now isn't just the economic damage, it's the political fallout. What makes this phase so intriguing is how China has chosen its moment. Years after the peak of the trade war, when many thought the worst had passed, China has begun to quietly restrict maritime access to ships tied to Trump-linked companies or interests. No grand announcement, no dramatic headlines, just port after port turning away American vessels associated with that administration's economic ideology. This is not a coincidence, Rio. It's a calculated strategic move, and it speaks volumes about how Beijing plays the long game. The deeper question here is, why now? Why wait until after Trump has left office to exact this kind of quiet punishment? Some analysts suggest it's about timing. China understands that Trump remains a dominant figure in American politics, with a potential return in 2024. These actions serve as a subtle message not just to him, but to the world. China does not forget, and it does not forgive easily. It waits. And when the moment is right, it reminds those who tried to challenge it that there are consequences. The genius, or danger, of this tactic lies in its subtlety. There are no explosions, no public threats, just silent resistance delivered through bureaucratic decisions at major trade ports. This form of retaliation is particularly damaging because it strikes at logistics, the hidden arteries of the global economy. When ships are denied entry, entire schedules collapse, goods spoil, markets falter, and companies lose money, fast. What's more, this disruption affects smaller businesses disproportionately. While major corporations might find workarounds, smaller exporters who had built their supply chains around Chinese cooperation are left stranded. And many of these businesses, ironically, are based in rural, conservative areas that once stood firmly behind Trump's America First doctrine. Even more troubling is how this situation highlights a growing shift in global alliances. Countries like Brazil, Vietnam, and Russia are eagerly stepping in to fill the vacuum left by restricted American access. China, far from being isolated by Trump's tactics, has deepened trade ties with other nations. It has signed regional agreements, expanded infrastructure projects through the Belt and Road Initiative, and fortified its role in organizations where U.S. influence has waned. In other words, Trump's attempt to isolate China economically may have achieved the opposite effect, consolidating Beijing's position and encouraging other nations to pivot eastward. Meanwhile, American exporters are caught in a geopolitical crossfire they never signed up for. They didn't make the policy decisions. They didn't write the tariffs. Yet they're the ones paying the price, and quite literally. The frustration is growing, especially among farmers and manufacturers who now see the ripple effects of Trump's policies hitting home in the form of lost contracts and uncertain futures. This isn't just about ships being turned away. It's about the symbolism of power, the quiet force of diplomacy, and the long-term consequences of short-term political gambits. It raises uncomfortable questions about how nations should engage in economic warfare, and whether the costs are truly worth the headlines. As China continues to exert its influence not with tanks or troops, but with trade and patience, the world is watching, and so is America, now forced to reassess its strategy as it navigates the fallout of a trade war that, despite all the promises, did not end in victory. Now I want to bring you into this conversation. Do you think Trump underestimated China's ability to hit back in silence? Or was this outcome inevitable from the start? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Even a single word like retaliation or strategy helps us keep this dialogue alive. China tightens maritime restrictions. As tensions simmer beneath the surface, China has begun executing one of its most effective tools of economic warfare, quietly, methodically, and with surgical precision. The refusal of port access to Trump-linked ships may seem like a minor technical decision at first glance, but in the world of global trade, such a move is a strategic earthquake. Shipping isn't just about transportation, it's about trust, reliability, and timing. When ports go silent or close doors, entire chains of commerce collapse. And when those decisions are tied to political affiliations, the message is unmistakable. China is not merely responding to past provocations, it's redefining the rules of engagement on its own terms. What's unfolding now is not your typical geopolitical standoff with cameras flashing and diplomats posturing. No, this is subtle warfare, where the battleground is a port authority office, and the weapon is a denial notice. China, in its signature long-game style, is weaponizing bureaucracy to send a message. It's targeting the very arteries of American commerce, but specifically those with visible ties to Trump's trade legacy. Companies that once championed Trump's policies are now finding themselves excluded from a market they depended on, and not because of failing products or poor contracts, but because they carry a political stain Beijing has decided it won't tolerate. What makes this maneuver so powerful is its ambiguity. Officially, there are no declarations, no press releases, no direct accusations. Everything operates under the radar. Vessels are held up for inspection. Access is delayed due to capacity issues, or paperwork is suddenly deemed insufficient. But behind these excuses lies an intentional and coordinated effort to choke access for specific commercial interests, slowly tightening the noose without triggering open confrontation. That's how China operates when it wants to punish. Quietly enough to maintain plausible deniability, but clearly enough that the message gets across, and the repercussions ripple outward. Logistics firms are thrown into chaos, trying to figure out why long-established routes are being rerouted or blocked. Insurance companies are reevaluating risks in East Asia. Freight rates are fluctuating. Contracts are being breached, not because companies failed to deliver, but because access has been politically compromised. The cost is astronomical, but perhaps more importantly, it's psychological. Partners and investors start questioning reliability. Doubt creeps in. Markets react to instability faster than they respond to policy. And in this case, the instability isn't natural, it's deliberately engineered. This is more than a trade story, it's a control story. China is demonstrating its mastery over its own ports and its willingness to leverage that control for geopolitical effect. For years, the West believed in the idea of open global trade, that ports are neutral, markets are fair, and goods move freely. But China is now proving what many feared, that access to its vast domestic market and logistical infrastructure is a privilege, not a right. That privilege can be suspended, modified, or revoked based on memory, ideology, and retaliation. And for companies still clinging to the illusion that business is separate from politics, this is a wake-up call. The irony is biting. Many of the firms now affected were once vocal in support of Trump's tough-on-China stance. They cheered the tariffs, celebrated the pressure, and lobbied for policies they believed would rebalance trade. But now, they are discovering that the geopolitical pendulum swings both ways. And sometimes, it comes back sharper than expected. No protest, no negotiation, no PR campaign can undo the quiet blockade China is assembling. These restrictions are custom-built, deliberately vague and highly effective. And more than anything, they are personal. Even global shipping hubs like Singapore and Hong Kong are feeling the pressure. While they remain open, their proximity to mainland China means they are closely watching Beijing's moves. Companies that once used these ports as safe alternatives are beginning to feel uncertainty creep in. What happens if the next phase of China's retaliation extends beyond Trump-linked entities and targets broader American economic interests? What if this is only the beginning of a long-term shift in maritime diplomacy, where access is no longer based on commerce, but on compliance? And perhaps most concerning of all is that these decisions are largely invisible to the public eye. They're not front-page news, they don't go viral on social media, but they're happening, quietly, daily, systematically. This is power being exerted not through speeches or sanctions, but through silence, the kind of silence that sinks billions in trade volume without a single shot fired. I want to know what you think about this silent strategy. Is China outplaying the US by turning logistics into leverage? Or is this just a dangerous game that risks destabilizing the global economy even further? Drop your thoughts below, even if it's just a word like logistics or strategy shift. Your comments drive this conversation forward and show the algorithm that this topic matters. US exporters sound the alarm. As the pressure from China's quiet maritime restrictions intensifies, the alarm bells are no longer just echoing in think tanks or foreign policy panels. They're ringing loud in America's heartland. From soybean fields in Iowa to high-tech manufacturing plants in Texas, U.S. exporters are beginning to feel the sting of a policy shift they have no control over, but can no longer ignore. What was once an abstract geopolitical standoff has now become a day-to-day business crisis, with real consequences for livelihoods, contracts, and the future of American competitiveness abroad. It starts with delays, subtle at first, just a few extra days at a port, a document that takes a little longer to be cleared. Then it becomes rerouted shipments, unexpected fees, canceled orders, and soon after, what used to be dependable trade lanes are now logistical nightmares. American companies, particularly in agriculture and mid-sized manufacturing, are waking up to the harsh reality that access to the Chinese market, once taken for granted, is now highly politicized and increasingly out of reach. For these exporters, the blockade isn't just symbolic. It's a direct attack on their business model. Entire supply chains that were optimized for China's scale, speed, and demand are now falling apart. The hardest hit are the ones least equipped to adapt quickly. Family-owned farms that invested heavily in machinery, labor, and logistics based on long-term Chinese contracts are now watching harvests rot in storage facilities. Warehouses are full, but ports are closed. Products are ready, but buyers have disappeared. These aren't speculative losses. They're tangible, immediate, and devastating. Many of these businesses operate on tight margins. A few months of disruption can mean bankruptcy, and unlike the multinationals that can absorb losses or pivot to alternative markets, these smaller players are dangerously exposed. What's particularly painful is that many of these exporters were vocal supporters of Trump's hardline China policy. They believed in the promise that pressure would lead to better trade terms. They trusted the idea that tariffs and tough talk would ultimately bring jobs back home and give American producers the upper hand. But what they're witnessing now is the opposite. Instead of leverage, they've been handed isolation. Instead of resurgence, they're facing rejection, and the frustration is palpable. Quietly in boardrooms and town halls, the conversation is shifting. The faith in political promises is eroding, replaced by the cold reality of containers stuck at sea and contracts left unsigned. Meanwhile, Chinese buyers, who once depended on U.S. exports for everything from soybeans to microchips, are adapting quickly. They've diversified suppliers, increased domestic production, and found new partners in countries like Brazil, Argentina, Russia, and Vietnam. In doing so, they've reduced their dependence on American goods and made it easier to sustain long-term restrictions without major internal disruption. For every American exporter now struggling to maintain relevance in the Chinese market, there's a competitor elsewhere happily filling that vacuum. And let's not forget the secondary effects. The trucking companies that relied on hauling goods to port, the freight forwarders who scheduled those shipments, the packaging plants that prepped those exports, all of them are now dealing with reduced demand, shrinking revenues, and rising uncertainty. The ripple effect is enormous, cutting across sectors and states, silently choking parts of the U.S. economy not often featured in policy debates. What adds another layer of complexity is that many of these disruptions can't be fixed with diplomacy alone. Even if a new administration were to reverse course or reopen talks with Beijing, trust has already been broken. The damage, in many ways, is psychological. Chinese partners now view American exporters, especially those with visible ties to the Trump era, as politically risky. This perception is hard to shake, even with new policies or friendlier rhetoric. It's not just about contracts anymore. It's about reliability, consistency, and geopolitical risk management. And still, the most haunting aspect of this crisis is its invisibility. The media doesn't show rows of unsold crops or idle factories. Politicians don't campaign on disrupted exports or lost trade deals. But for the people living it, this isn't theoretical. It's their everyday survival. And their anger, while often silent, is starting to simmer. What began as patriotic support for an America First agenda is now turning into deep economic anxiety, even betrayal. How do you tell a farmer who lost his top international buyer that this is a sign of success? This is not just a trade issue, it's a cultural fracture. It's an identity crisis, and it's forcing a reckoning across communities that once proudly waved the banner of economic nationalism. Now, they are left to grapple with a market that's moving on without them. I want to hear from those of you watching who work in agriculture, logistics, or manufacturing. Have you felt this kind of disruption in your industry? Or do you think this is just growing pains that will eventually stabilize? Comment below. Even words like exports, soy crisis, or supply shock help boost the conversation and bring more voices into this important discussion. Geopolitical message behind the ban. What many initially viewed as a purely economic maneuver is now revealing itself as something far deeper, a calculated geopolitical message crafted with precision. China's decision to block port access to Trump-affiliated vessels is not just about retaliating against past policies. It's about reshaping the global power narrative. Behind every denied cargo ship, every rerouted container, every inexplicable customs delay, there's a strategic intent. Beijing isn't just closing its ports to punish a former president. It's speaking directly to the world, in a language of strength, memory, and control. And the message is chillingly clear. We remember everything, and we wait for the right moment to respond. This isn't about tariffs anymore. It's about positioning, about reminding the United States, and particularly Trump's faction, that global influence doesn't belong to the loudest voice or the boldest threat. It belongs to those who understand timing, leverage, and subtlety. The decision to wait years before initiating this port-based retaliation wasn't a delay. It was a tactic. China knows that open confrontation rarely benefits its long-term strategy. Instead, it prefers to wait for the noise to die down, for the spotlight to move on, and then it makes its move, quietly, but with lasting impact. And let's not underestimate the psychological warfare in play here. For decades, American foreign policy has operated from a position of assumed dominance. The expectation was simple: U.S. pressure would force other nations to yield. But now, China is flipping that script. By targeting vessels connected to Trump's legacy, they are isolating a specific political identity and drawing a line in the sand. It's not the United States as a whole being punished. It's the ideology that tried to contain and challenge them, being methodically sidelined. That distinction is powerful, because it tells the rest of the world that China isn't interested in blind retaliation. It wants to punish deliberately, symbolically, and with maximum resonance. In diplomatic circles, this is already being analyzed as a new phase of international signaling, one that blends commerce, politics, and image building. China is showing that it can retaliate without escalating to open conflict. It's saying, we don't need to sanction you, we can simply ignore you. And in a world built on economic interdependence, that kind of exclusion can be far more punishing than a missile or a military maneuver, because exclusion implies irrelevance. And for a global superpower like the US, that's a far more dangerous blow to credibility than any speech or sanction. Even more intriguing is how this move is being interpreted by US allies. In Europe, Southeast Asia, and parts of Latin America, governments and corporate leaders are watching closely. They're seeing how China responds not with bluster, but with leverage. They're taking note of how Beijing is using its ports, its literal gateways to the world, as instruments of soft power and hard consequence. And in boardrooms from Brussels to Buenos Aires, the calculation is shifting. If China can isolate American entities so precisely, who's really holding the upper hand in the post-pandemic global order? Let's also consider the internal message this sends within China. Domestically, this port strategy bolsters the narrative of a strong, unyielding leadership that doesn't let past humiliations slide. It plays directly into nationalist sentiment, especially among younger generations who are increasingly skeptical of Western intentions. By framing these denials as justified responses to Trump-era aggression, China reinforces its own vision of sovereignty, one that's not just about defending borders, but about asserting dominance on global terms. There's also a deeper psychological layer. The ban isn't loud, but it is humiliating. It forces American companies to beg for access, to reapply, to renegotiate on terms they no longer control. It sends the signal that the era of American exceptionalism is being reevaluated, not through grand speeches but through paperwork delays, rejected shipping manifests, and quiet refusals. The power dynamic is shifting not in dramatic confrontations, but in drawn-out silences. And that silence, it speaks volumes. It tells us that economic retaliation has evolved. No longer is it about crashing currencies or blowing up trade deals. Now it's about subtle isolation. It's about being locked out of opportunity while the rest of the world moves forward. The long game China is playing here doesn't require a crisis. It only requires time, patience, and precision. And those are three things the current American political climate struggles to maintain. The ultimate message is not just for Trump or his supporters. It's for any future leader who believes that short-term aggression can bend long-term power structures. It's a warning that today's speeches can become tomorrow's liabilities, and that in the world of global strategy, nothing is ever forgotten, only delayed. What's your take on this deeper signal? Do you think China is using this moment to reshape its image as the new global standard bearer? Or is this simply tit for tat dressed in strategy? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Even words like power shift, economic war, or strategic silence help bring more people into this conversation and keep the dialogue alive. American companies distance themselves. As the pressure mounts and the global narrative shifts, something remarkable is happening behind the scenes. A quiet but steady distancing of major American companies from anything tied to Trump-era trade ideology. This isn't about political allegiance anymore. It's about survival. In boardrooms from Silicon Valley to Chicago, executives are reassessing their exposure, not just to Chinese markets, but to the reputational damage that comes from being associated with the policies that led to this current impasse. The landscape of global commerce is transforming, and with it, the calculus of branding, alliances, and long-term strategy. Many of these companies were once emboldened by Trump's America First doctrine, believing that the U.S. could impose its economic will on the world without significant consequence. Now, they're realizing that such bravado doesn't translate well across oceans. Instead of dominance, they're encountering resistance, subtle, strategic, and increasingly costly. Access to international markets, especially China, is no longer a matter of competitive pricing or innovation. It's about perception, compliance, and geopolitical baggage. Being too visibly aligned with a particular political moment, especially one seen as antagonistic abroad, has turned into a liability that no major corporation can afford. This is particularly evident in the tech and manufacturing sectors, where companies must navigate supply chains that are deeply interwoven with Chinese infrastructure. Firms that once lobbied hard for protectionist policies are now quietly deleting references, scaling back rhetoric, and even restructuring partnerships to give the appearance of neutrality. It's an attempt to wash off the residual stain of trade aggression and reintroduce themselves to the global market as apolitical, adaptable, and cooperative players. Behind closed doors, PR firms are being hired to audit brand language, public statements are being revised, and internal memos emphasize the importance of distancing from past postures. CEOs who once appeared on stage with Trump, praising his economic vision, are now opting for silence, or in some cases open rebranding. Companies that had previously boasted of being patriot first are now reorienting their message around global responsibility and multilateral resilience. It's a pivot driven not by ideology, but by necessity. Investors are paying attention too. International funds are increasingly scrutinizing not just a company's financial health, but its geopolitical footprint. Is this brand welcome in Beijing? How much exposure does it have to restricted shipping lanes or sensitive technology disputes? These questions are no longer theoretical. They impact valuations, stock volatility, and long-term investor confidence. The result is a growing preference for low-profile, globally integrated operations over high-profile, politically charged domestic champions. The shift is also cultural. Inside these companies, younger employees, especially those in marketing, compliance, and global partnerships, are pushing for clearer lines between political affiliation and corporate identity. They understand the long-term risks of being seen as extensions of state power, particularly when that power is out of favor in international eyes. For many, this distancing is not just strategic, it's a matter of conscience. The new generation of decision-makers wants companies to be agile, open, and respected across borders, not entangled in the volatile narratives of populist politics. Of course, this distancing isn't always overt. It's often hidden in structural decisions, moving factories out of politically sensitive zones, diversifying suppliers, investing in markets that offer diplomatic insulation. But the pattern is undeniable. American firms are quietly uncoupling from Trumpism in the interest of global legitimacy. And in doing so, they're acknowledging a deeper truth, that in today's world, economic power is as much about perception as it is about performance. If a company is seen as hostile, arrogant, or aligned with a legacy of conflict, it risks exclusion, no matter how efficient or profitable it may be. This trend raises profound questions about the future of American capitalism. What happens when the private sector no longer mirrors the political ideology of its own government? What does it mean when companies must choose between national loyalty and international relevance? These are not questions with easy answers, but they are becoming impossible to avoid, especially as geopolitical tensions move from headlines to balance sheets. The quiet exodus from Trump-linked narratives also signals a broader change in global corporate leadership. The old model, aggressive, nationalistic, zero-sum, is being replaced by something more cautious, collaborative, and multilateral. It's not weakness, it's adaptation. It's the recognition that in a world where market access can be revoked with a signature or a policy shift, the smartest move is often the softest one: to blend in, to listen, to evolve. What do you think about this corporate recalibration? Are companies abandoning their principles, or are they just being realistic about the future? Share your thoughts below. Even just writing corporate shift, strategy change, or business realignment helps amplify this conversation and invites more people into the dialogue. AC looks elsewhere. While American companies scramble to rebrand and recover lost ground, another movement is quietly unfolding across Asia, one that may reshape the balance of global trade for decades to come. As China tightens its grip on who gets access to its colossal market and who doesn't, countries across the region are stepping into the vacuum left by strained US-China relations. This isn't happening with fireworks or formal announcements. It's happening in the quiet corridors of commerce, in late-night negotiations between diplomats, in ports where containers are being stamped not with "Made in USA," but with markings from Brazil, Russia, and Southeast Asia. The shift is subtle, but the implications are massive, because if America once believed it was the indispensable partner in Asia's economic rise, that belief is being challenged, and in many cases, outright replaced. Take Brazil, for instance. Long considered an agricultural competitor, Brazil has rapidly expanded its trade agreements with China, filling in the gaps left by declining American exports. Their soybeans, corn, and beef are flowing into Chinese ports at a volume that was once unthinkable. And it's not just agriculture. Russia, despite being entangled in its own geopolitical web, is deepening energy ties with China, selling oil, gas, and minerals, while avoiding many of the political pitfalls that have ensnared American firms. The message to the region is unmistakable. If one superpower withdraws or is pushed out, others are ready to step in, and fast. In Southeast Asia, the mood is even more telling. Countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, and Malaysia are taking strategic advantage of the US. China rift to position themselves as neutral, flexible, and ready to do business. Manufacturing that once took place in China but served American firms is now being reconfigured to serve Chinese demand directly or to route through third countries for less political baggage. The US is no longer the automatic first call for trade, investment, or tech collaboration. There's a new pragmatism in the air, a realism shaped by the volatility of the past decade, where alliances shifted faster than containers could cross oceans. Much of this transition is happening below the surface. It's not that countries in Asia have suddenly turned against the US. It's that they can no longer afford to be tied to a partner seen as unpredictable or internally divided. Trump's aggressive posture toward China, and toward multilateral agreements in general, left a bad taste in the mouths of many regional leaders. When you tear up trade pacts, walk away from climate deals, and openly question long-standing alliances, people remember, governments remember, and in international commerce, memory is everything. That memory is now shaping how Asia engages with the world. China, for all its flaws and political tensions, offers consistency. Its state-backed initiatives may be rigid, but they are long-term. It doesn't exit trade deals based on election cycles. It doesn't pull funding or renegotiate pacts every 4 years. That kind of reliability, even if it comes with strings attached, is attractive to nations that depend on export stability, infrastructure development, and predictable investment flows. And with the Belt and Road Initiative still expanding across the region, China is embedding itself not just as a market, but as an indispensable trade partner. Meanwhile, American influence, though far from gone, is becoming more conditional. It's tied to political wins, congressional debates, and campaign platforms. One administration promises partnership, the next threatens sanctions. This kind of inconsistency is not sustainable in a region where timing is everything, where a delayed shipment can crash quarterly earnings, and a trade dispute can reroute decades of economic planning. So the shift isn't ideological, it's practical. Asia is choosing what works, not what once symbolized democracy or market freedom. And then there's the optics. In the eyes of many Asian leaders, watching American companies publicly distance themselves from Trump's trade vision sends a very clear message. Even America doesn't fully stand behind its former strategy. That creates a vacuum of authority, a moment where loyalty begins to drift not because of disagreement but because of confusion. In that fog, China steps forward not just as a rival, but as a stabilizer, not necessarily the friend everyone wants, but the partner everyone might need. What's happening now is a rebalancing, a slow, deliberate shifting of gravity. And while the US still has immense leverage, military, economic, cultural, it's no longer operating from a position of assumed dominance. That world is fading. In its place is a more competitive, more cautious, and more fragmented landscape where credibility matters more than charisma, and where consistent access beats momentary promises. Are we watching the beginning of a new trade order in Asia? Do you think this pivot toward alternative partners is permanent or just temporary until the US recalibrates its strategy? Drop your perspective in the comments. Even just a word like realignment, Asia shift, or new order helps keep this conversation alive and pushes the algorithm to share it with others who care about these deeper global dynamics. Chinese media celebrates victory. As this global rebalancing accelerates and American influence in key Asian trade corridors recedes, one voice has become noticeably louder and more confident: China's state-controlled media. Outlets like the Global Times, Xinhua, and CCTV have seized the moment not only to report, but to craft a victory narrative, one that elevates China's patience and resilience as superior to the volatility and short-sightedness of American policy, particularly under the Trump administration. And this messaging isn't just for domestic consumption. It's a calculated campaign with external targets, one designed to reinforce Beijing's image as a steady global force and to frame the recent wave of port restrictions and trade reconfigurations as justified, necessary, and ultimately triumphant. Chinese media is expert at operating on two levels. It speaks to the internal audience in a tone of national pride and revival, while it signals to the international community through subtle cues and diplomatic language. What's particularly striking in this moment is how openly the Chinese narrative frames Trump's trade war as a strategic blunder, not a fight, not a rivalry, but a mistake made by an impatient adversary who underestimated China's strategic depth. Editorials have painted a picture of calm resistance, of a nation that took the hits, recalibrated behind closed doors, and emerged stronger, more focused, and better aligned with global markets than before. The phrase that keeps recurring across headlines is, "The tide has turned." And that metaphor is telling. It implies inevitability, a slow and unstoppable shift that has less to do with confrontation and more to do with the natural flow of global power realigning itself. According to these narratives, Trump's attempts to destabilize China's economic ascent were never going to succeed because they were reactive, emotional, and rooted in outdated Cold War thinking. In contrast, China is portrayed as deliberate, strategic, and above all, patient. This framing isn't just rhetoric. It's part of a long-term strategy to reposition China not as the underdog of global trade, but as the referee. In speeches, reports, and televised discussions, state media analysts speak not of confrontation, but of maturity, a term used repeatedly to describe how China responded to 4 years of tariffs, accusations, and restrictions. Maturity, in this context, means not responding blow for blow, but letting time and pressure do the work. And now that the US is grappling with internal division, political fatigue, and international reputational damage, Chinese commentators are presenting this as the outcome of that patience. Victory in their eyes wasn't won in courtrooms or negotiations. It was won by endurance. What's more, Chinese media is spotlighting the cracks now showing in American strategy. They highlight the anxiety of U.S. exporters, the distancing behavior of American corporations, the shifting allegiances of Asian partners. These stories aren't random. They're selected carefully to reinforce a central thesis. China cannot be cornered, and any attempt to isolate it will ultimately isolate the one who tries. It's an inversion of the American narrative, and one that many developing nations, weary of Western volatility, are beginning to pay attention to. Perhaps most fascinating is how Chinese media uses silence as much as language. There's an almost surgical focus on not attacking Biden directly, maintaining a sense of neutrality toward the current administration. This allows the blame to remain centered on Trump, isolating his ideology while preserving diplomatic maneuverability with current U.S. leadership. It's a move that suggests long-term thinking and an awareness that relationships with the U.S. might be necessary in the future, just not with those tied too closely to past aggression. The domestic reception to this victory narrative is also worth noting. Chinese citizens, particularly the younger, digitally native generation, are being exposed to a wave of nationalistic storytelling that connects personal pride to global status. Videos circulating on WeChat and Douyin, China's TikTok, celebrate not just economic resilience but cultural superiority, showing China as a country that didn't bend or break under Western pressure. There's a visible shift from defensive nationalism to confident assertion, a psychological pivot that reinforces loyalty and support for the government's broader global vision. For Western audiences, especially those tuned into the nuances of media manipulation and political messaging, this may seem like textbook propaganda, but that doesn't make it ineffective. In fact, that calculated simplicity is what makes it so persuasive. By keeping the message clear that China played the long game and won, state media ensures that even in regions without strong allegiances, the perception of power now favors the East. And in geopolitics, perception often precedes reality. I'd love to hear what you think about this strategy. Do you believe China's use of media to reshape the narrative is working on the world stage? Or do you see through the messaging as a soft power move with limited reach? Drop your insights in the comments. Even short phrases like media war, narrative control, or soft power rise help expand this. See what this means for 2024. As this intricate web of consequences continues to tighten, the question on everyone's mind, from political strategists in Washington to business analysts in Shanghai, is what all of this means for the upcoming 2024 U.S. presidential election. Because while the effects of Trump's trade war are still echoing across global ports and corporate boardrooms, their political aftershocks are beginning to shake the very foundation of America's internal debate about leadership, credibility, and global standing. The 2024 race is no longer just about domestic policy or party loyalty. It's increasingly about whether the United States is seen, both at home and abroad, as a reliable, stable, and forward-thinking power. And the damage done by the Trump administration's trade decisions with China is now being measured in more than dollars. It's being measured in trust. Trump's potential return to the political stage reopens every wound that global partners and economic actors had barely begun to bandage. The narrative surrounding his leadership is no longer built solely on ideology. It's built on memory, and that memory is filled with volatility, abrupt decisions, trade uncertainty, and a foreign policy style that favored confrontation over cooperation. China's port restrictions, the distancing of U.S. companies, the shifting trade alliances in Asia, all of it feeds directly into a growing international skepticism about America's ability to maintain a consistent direction. And that skepticism has become part of the conversation on the campaign trail, whether explicitly or not, while Trump's base continues to support him fervently, believing in the righteousness of his tough-on-China approach. A new awareness is emerging among undecided voters and more moderate conservatives. They're asking different questions now. Not just, did he fight back against unfair trade? But what did that fight actually cost us? They're looking at the shipping delays, the farmer bankruptcies, the corporate retreats, and the way America is increasingly sidelined in global decision-making, and wondering if pride was worth the price. At the same time, his potential challengers, whether within the GOP or across the aisle, are recalibrating their message. They're not just running on policy platforms. They're positioning themselves as the alternative to chaos. To be electable in 2024 may require proving not only that you can stand up to foreign powers, but that you can do so without dismantling the very relationships that allow the U.S. to project strength in the first place. The image of leadership is evolving. It's no longer enough to look strong. Now, a leader must appear calculated, steady, globally respected. And that's not the persona many remember from the Trump years, especially outside the United States. This shift in perception is also playing out in subtle ways across campaign financing and international commentary. Foreign media, particularly in allied nations, are beginning to cautiously re-engage with the American election cycle, but there's a new tone, one of watchfulness rather than enthusiasm. In interviews and op-eds, diplomats and international CEOs are expressing concern, albeit diplomatically, about the risks of a return to Trump-era volatility. These signals may not make the headlines in mainstream U.S. coverage, but they are deeply felt in the corridors of power where decisions are made about military alliances, economic investment, and long-term cooperation. Another critical aspect is how this impacts America's soft power. In an era where influence is often exerted through culture, media, education, and technological dominance, the impression that America is unpredictable, internally fractured, or driven by personalities over principles erodes the moral leadership it once wielded. A Trump resurgence in 2024, viewed through the lens of the past 4 years' fallout, could further diminish that influence. It may embolden rivals, unsettle allies, and create hesitation in future multilateral initiatives, including those related to climate, global health, and security. But beyond the international scope, what matters just as much is how American voters process this moment. The average citizen may not track maritime restrictions or foreign supply chain strategies, but they absolutely feel the effects. In the prices at the supermarket, in the availability of products, in job markets reshaped by manufacturing shifts. And when campaign season intensifies, they'll be asked to make a choice not just about values but about consequences. Who will lead us not only with passion, but with vision, not just against others but towards something lasting? That's why 2024 feels less like a normal election and more like a referendum on what kind of global actor the United States wants to be. Will it continue down a path where short-term wins dominate long-term thinking? Or will it recognize the cost of burning bridges that take decades to rebuild? The answer won't just shape America's future. It will send signals across every ocean, through every port, and into every office where decisions are made about who to trust, who to follow, and who to bet on in the decades to come. How are you personally interpreting this lead-up to 2024? Do you think the world is watching the U.S. with concern or curiosity? Share your thoughts below. Even writing 2024 Impact, Global Trust, or Leadership Test can help keep this dialogue active and invite more minds into the conversation. Conversation and make sure more voices are heard. If you've made it this far, it means you didn't just watch a video. You took part in a journey. And now, we want to hear from you. How did this message speak to your heart? Was there a moment that stirred something deeper in you? A sentence, an idea, a truth that made you pause and reflect? Please share with us in the comments below by writing, "I felt the voice of God in this video." Let this be more than a comment. Let it be a testimony, a declaration that even in the midst of complex geopolitics, shifting alliances, and economic uncertainty, God still speaks. He still reaches hearts. He still reveals truth, and He still moves powerfully, even through topics that seem far removed from faith. We believe that these messages are not just information. They are inspiration. They are revelation. They are tools to awaken critical thinking and spiritual awareness in a time when both are desperately needed. So if this content touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next word that could transform your perspective. Leave a like to help us expand this mission. Every click is a seed you're planting into someone else's life. And most importantly, share this video with someone who needs clarity, encouragement, or simply a reminder that God is still guiding, still revealing, and still present. And yes, there's already another powerful message waiting for you on the end screen. Don't miss it. May God bless your life abundantly, bring peace to your thoughts, and purpose to your days. We'll see you in the next video.